Today's episode is a free preview of our sister podcast, To Save Us From Hell. This is the only independent podcast about the United Nations. Co-host Anjali, Dayal, and I are bona fide UN experts. I've covered the UN as a journalist for nearly 20 years. Anjali is a professor of international relations at Fordham University who teaches and researches and studies the UN. And with our powers combined, we bring you insights and analysis about all things United Nations that you simply can't find elsewhere. Full episodes of To Save Us From Hell are available exclusively to paying subscribers. You can get a subscription via globaldispatches.org following the links in the show notes of this episode, or if you're listening directly in Apple Podcasts, you can unlock a subscription in-app. What we're doing with this show is truly unique, and I hope that you will help us keep this show alive and sustain our coverage of the United Nations. Enjoy the episode.
That is violent activity that this force is proposed to undertake. And that's not a recipe for success for the United Nations.
Welcome to Save Us From Hell, a podcast about the United Nations. I'm your co-host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I'm the host of Global Dispatches. I run UN Dispatch, and To Save Us From Hell, of course, is a project of Global Dispatches.
I'm Anjali Dayal. I'm an associate professor of international politics at Fordham University in New York, and I teach and I do research and I write about the United Nations.
And Anjali can read a Security Council resolution with panache, which will be revealed later in this episode. That was fun. I just, for listeners unaware, I just watched Anjali read a Security Council resolution, and it was something to behold.
Yeah, you know how some people can chop onions with their eyes closed?
So, a lot to discuss today. We're going to kick off with a conversation of our post-UNGA reflections. You know, the last time we chatted, of course, was in the height of UNGA. Donald Trump had just stopped on his escalator. His teleprompter had stopped working. Some random Portuguese translator overrode his English translation. And of course, 130-something other presidents and prime ministers were at the UN. Speaking about being at the UN, I was at the UN just yesterday. In fact, I moderated a panel discussion hosted by the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, the German think tank. It was a lot of fun. It was interesting. It was part of a series that FES is hosting calling the East River Dialogues on the Future of Multilateralism. Great name, by the way.
Yeah, great name. I have been lucky enough to work with them this year also on a policy brief about the selection of the next Secretary General, and it's really interesting to see how many creative different takes they have on what comes after this.
So I was the moderator of a panel discussion. You know, I love moderating these kinds of things. So, you know, put me on stage, give me a microphone, let me ask some questions. That's my happy place. Co-panelists were Esther Brimmer, who I think listeners might remember was Obama's Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs and is now a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. And an academic you are probably familiar with, Amitav Acharya, who has interesting things to say about the future of world order and also the history of world orders as well. And, you know, this conversation, there are about maybe 50 diplomats and dignitaries and civil society representatives in the room. And what I appreciated about this whole East River Dialogue series in general, and our conversation in particular, was how, you know, it's intended to give those in the room who manage crises on a day-to-day basis, who are just very much in the nuts and bolts of the UN every single day, an opportunity to step back, think long-term, think big picture. And it was a rich and lively discussion held under Chatham House rules. So I can't get into too much detail, but it was great.
Yeah, on pain of
not being invited back.
And not being invited back.
It was a good time. And honestly, you know, it's remarkable how just as a physical space, the United Nations is different after UNGA than during UNGA. It was calm, it was chill.
Yeah.
People weren't rushing anywhere. But speaking about UNGA, Anjali, here we are, 10 days after the conclusion of UNGA. Again, last time you and I chatted, it was in the height of things,
Mhm.
with the opportunity of reflection. Any kind of lasting UNGA takeaways that you would cite?
To some extent, it was interesting to me how normal of an UNGA it was, despite the fact that, there's this omnishambles crisis creeping around the edge of every corner. There was less talk, at least in what I heard, about the UN's sort of omnipresent crisis, and more talk about bread and butter issues that are facing member states. And I found that to be quite interesting, actually.
Hmm.
We noted it a little bit in our conversation with Maya, but even, Antonio Guterres pivoted out a little from the situation at the UN and towards a sort of set of dialogues about what member states could do, what kind of world they wanted to live in. And I thought that was interesting. So much of the dialogue about what's happening at the UN right now has been, about the UNAID initiative, about the problems of funding, the existential issues that are, making some people talk about managed decline and some people talking about retrenchment. And to a large extent, I didn't find those to be the headline moments of UNGA. That might be because there's so much roiling crisis, right? Both manufactured and actual, that necessarily that kind of stuff has to take a backseat when world leaders are present.
Yeah, beyond, I would say, what was said at UNGA, one of the enduring, I think, values of UNGA is just that it is a physical space
Yeah.
where so many diplomats and world leaders are at one time that gives them the opportunity to meet with each other. It's often called diplomatic speed dating.
Yes.
And in the week or so following UNGA, there have been some major kind of diplomatic moves, particularly on Israel and Gaza. And interestingly, I was speaking with a friend who follows Gaza and Israel diplomacy very, very closely. And she, kind of pointed a straight line between the gatherings at UNGA, who met who under what circumstances, and Trump's announcement of that, peace plan for Gaza. The outcome of that peace plan is uncertain at time of recording, but I think it's fair to say that we are closer to the release of hostages and a potential ceasefire than we have in the last 2 years since October 7th. And, that very well likely potentially flowed from some of diplomatic encounters that happened at UNGA.
Yeah, diplomacy is social. It's a social process. It is, as much as things like international peace and security and trade policy are made with an eye towards big picture ideas, and as much as they're made with an eye towards domestic concerns, the actual work of diplomacy is person to person, face to face, relationship to relationship. And on that measure, there remains nothing like the global forum of UNGA. You and I have talked about your framework for the UN that talks and the UN that does, right?
Hmm.
UNGA shows us how the UN that talks facilitates the UN that does.
Hmm.
That you can make these kinds of breakthroughs in person to person conversations, even in casual, particularly sometimes in casual sort of meetings that can't happen elsewhere because they require too much work, too much staging, too much effort to have nothing come out of it, right? The stakes are too high sometimes when you have to arrange a diplomatic meeting between people, but they're low at UNGA. It's low stakes to set up a meeting on the side of something.
Yeah, not to get like maybe too IR theoretical, but these multilateral institutions, as I recall in grad school,
Mhm.
lower the transaction costs of doing diplomacy.
100% Robert Cohen and Lisa Martin, baby.
Was that my reference? I read the paper, but I am not a professor of international relations, so I
Robert's
couldn't
not the
cite the
only
authors.
citation, but yes, that's exactly right, right? They lowered the transaction costs, right? Imagine a world where everyone has to run around and meet 192 peers on a one-on-one basis. You're never gonna get anything done. Imagine even a world where the EU has to coordinate with the AU and the Organization of American States and whatnot. It's not an effective way to produce global agreements. It's not an effective way to sort of catalyze solutions for big problems, but it is effective to get everybody together and to say, hey, talk as
Mhm.
you want, where you want, when you want for this week.
So, yes, the UN does provide a physical platform to lower the transaction costs of doing international diplomacy, but a couple of hiccups on the mechanics of that physical platform that the United Nations building provides that caused outsized anguish and angst for both the UN and, frankly, for US UN relations. And I'm referring, of course, to the infamously malfunctioning escalator. Anjali, escalator gate 2 weeks on.
So, in the most literal sense, Donald Trump hit a set of speed bumps at UNGA and they ruined his mood. They ruined his mood so hard that he had Fox News commentators calling basically for like an armed invasion of Turtle Bay. I'm not even exaggerating a little bit. I'm just reporting what happened. He got stuck on the first step of an escalator. The first step of an escalator. To be fair, Melania Trump, I think, was on the third step of the escalator. And then for the first 15 minutes or so of his speech, his teleprompter wasn't working. Both of those, it turns out, were the direct result of his own team's incompetence. But both of those things produced a week of dialogue about the conspiracy against Donald Trump at the United Nations.
Mhm.
And I have to say, I mean, not to sort of wish worse things than they're wishing, but if your idea of a conspiracy is like minor hijinks, like
Mhm.
pulling the escalator stop button and tampering with the teleprompter, then you live a very boring life.
I mean, I would say that as you and I have discussed many times on this show, Trump is not intrinsically hostile to the UN. And in fact, when he met Antonio Guterres, he said, Americans support the UN.
Yeah.
We have a lot of, hope in this building. I'm paraphrasing. And as you and I have noted, the one thing that Trump seems to like the most about the UN is like the pomp of it all, of UNGA, of being feted, of being like the big man on campus, which, to be fair, every American president is as the leader of the host country, but Trump garners more attention than most American presidents. And to me, what was so problematic and revealing, frankly, about Escalator Gate is that it seemed to at once undermine the one thing that Trump likes most about the UN, which is the photo ops, the kind of feeling of being celebrated in front of his peers.
Yeah.
And the reaction to Escalator Gate reveals just how fragile to me the US UN relations are at this moment.
Yeah.
A faulty escalator caused a major crisis
Yeah.
between the United States and the United Nations. And, that like shouldn't be the case. But given how fragile relations are right now, it was the case.
It reflects both a deeply personalist kind of rule that is at its very base sort of antithetical to the way that a rational, like bureaucratic state runs its foreign policy, obviously, and a reflection of the fact that this is a foreign policy team that is simultaneously very thin skinned and very incompetent.
Mhm.
And we see that reflected throughout a bunch of different arenas of UN behavior. A lot of what the US has been doing at the UN has been, even without editorializing, it would be hard not to classify it as petty. We talked a couple of weeks ago or months ago, I don't really remember at this point because what is time, about the US refusing to vote in favor of World Horse Day
Mm.
with the explicit note that it's because the General Assembly resolution contained text about the Sustainable Development Goals.
Mm.
Now, there's a substantive lack of fit between the US's new foreign policy goals and sustainable development goals. But it's also the case that if the US didn't want to vote for that resolution, it could have not shown up that day. It is the case that by showing up and voting against it, they're trying to make a point. Similarly, there is a real fracture point between the US and the United Nations, right? The fracture point is that the US is, under its current administration, an inward looking, isolationist, illiberal government, which is antithetical to the project of a liberal multilateralism. And there are ways to make that work when the principal agent is happy with stuff. And there's no way to make that work when the principal agent is unhappy with stuff. And so this is petty stuff. It's little stuff, right? Yeah, the escalator stopped. The teleprompter didn't load his speech right away. Under ordinary circumstances, someone might have been like, wow, I really need to get my funding in on time, huh? Stuff is not working around here. But these are times in which, because that relationship is substantively vexed and practically fragile, it ends up being a full news cycle. It's also the case that it's an outrage machine, right?
Yeah.
If it hadn't been that, it would have been something else.
So one last outcome of UNGA that I want to discuss, that we will discuss after the fold, was a Security Council resolution last week authorizing a new Gang Suppression Force for Haiti. That segment, plus Anjali and I's prediction for who will win the Nobel Peace Prize this coming Friday, is after the fold for paying subscribers. Please become a paying subscriber, support this work. We'll still run our September UNGA special. Go to globaldispatches.org/40% off, and that's the word percent, to get a big discount, and you'll get full episodes of To Save Us From Hell. But before we go to the jump, I secretly recorded Anjali reading the Security Council resolution that we will discuss after the fold. And friends, it was a sight to behold.
On the understanding that the cost of personnel will be borne by voluntary contributions and authorizes member states participating in the GSF in strict compliance with international law, including international human rights law, thank you Denmark for that, as applicable, and the UN's human blah blah blah, blah blah blah, blah blah blah.
Friends, this is how experts read Security Council resolutions. Thank you for listening to Save Us From Hell. The show is co-hosted by me, Mark Leon Goldberg, and Anjali Dayal. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. Our cover art is by Sarah D. Michelle. If you've not already done so, please subscribe to our show via Substack at globaldispatches.org. We are sustaining this show by selling subscriptions to it via Substack. You can get a discounted subscription by going to globaldispatches.org/saveus. You can follow the link in the show notes as well. And finally, if you'd like to discuss this episode with us, please visit globaldispatches.org and click on chat, where we'll be around to discuss what we discussed in this episode. Thanks, and be sure to tell friends and colleagues about To Save Us From Hell, a new podcast about the United Nations.